this week's 51%, we speak with psychiatrist and researcher Dr. Frank Putnam about a nearly 40-year-old study analyzing how child abuse specifically impacts girls and the women they become.
Talking about it helps in a couple of different ways. And one, as we said, those people who can talk about it seem less likely to repeat it. Also, talking about it doesn't give the perpetrators a place to hide.
I'm Jesse King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing. Shiloh leader, I wasn't really in it. I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jesse King. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 1 in 4 girls will experience child sexual abuse. It's a rough statistic, and it's hard to know how definitive it is because a lot of cases are never reported. When we see reports of child sex abuse in the news, we often focus a lot on the abuser, who they are, whether they have other victims, and in the case of the Epstein files, just how much the government will release about them. There's not always as much focus on how this abuse impacts children in the long term. Well, our guest today has spent decades studying exactly how this abuse affects girls and the women they become. Dr. Frank Putnam is a renowned psychiatrist, professor, and researcher on dissociative identity disorder and the health impacts of violence and abuse. He's a professor of clinical psychiatry at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine and professor emeritus of the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. Way back in 1987, Putnam worked with the late Dr. Penelope Trickett to start a landmark project called the Female Growth and Development Study, or FGDS. They did so with a specific goal: to assess the impacts of child sex abuse on girls, not simply by asking grown women to recount their abuse, but by following the lives of more than 100 girls from childhood through adulthood. Some of the study's subjects were survivors of sexual abuse, while others were not. Putnam says they've discovered the trauma of abuse transcends generations and impacts survivors in a way that can actually change their DNA, putting them at an increased risk for early puberty, obesity, premature births, mental illness, addiction, cognitive decline, and more. The FGDS, which is still running today at the University of Rochester, has informed more than 60 peer-reviewed articles worldwide, and even a best-selling book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. Dr. Trickett passed away in 2016, and after receiving his own terminal diagnosis, Putnam says he wanted to write as definitive an account as possible of his time with the FGDS, compiling decades' worth of academic papers into one book made easy for readers to digest. Part memoir, part call to action, old before their time, outlines the study's findings and offers Putnam's solutions to better address and prevent child abuse. Just a heads up to our listeners that this conversation may be triggering for some. If you or someone you love has been impacted by child sex abuse, Child Help has counselors available 24/7 at its hotline, 1-800-422-4453. Child Help also has a list of state-by-state contacts where you can report child abuse at its website, childhelphotline.org. I guess just to start off, tell me a little bit about how this study got started back in the 1980s. You say in the book that it was kind of an offshoot from your work studying dissociative identity disorder.
Well, it was way back in the 80s. And I had just come out of my psychiatry residency at Yale, and I was very interested in rapid changes in emotional state or mental state. So, panic attacks, switches between bipolar disorder, between depression and mania, flashbacks and PTSD, catatonic states, and what were the mechanisms behind them. And so I was on a ward that was studying rapid psyching bipolar patients at the National Institute of Mental Health. And I did run across a dissociative identity patient. In those days, they were called multiple personality disorder, and they changed the name about 1994. And after I'd seen 3 of these cases where people were switching among these different altered personalities, I thought this was pretty amazing and needed to be studied. And so I began working with, and probably saw about 24 of these cases, all of whom told me that they had been this way since childhood, that they had never been sort of what we might call a single personality that exploded into fragments. They had always been multiple and had really sort of failed to come together in a more integrated state. I thought if this is true, I should be able to find children with this condition. And so I began looking at children, and after I saw well over 100 children, and all of whom were very seriously behaviorally disturbed. But I also thought I saw biological things happening to these children also, particularly happening to their bodies. And I began to think that really the common thread here was not so much that they had a dissociative disorder, but that it had all been sexually abused in childhood. Now, this was way back in the 80s when really this was not on anybody's radar. And most of the time I was working with foster parents or therapists, and all they knew was, well, they tell me the child was abused or something like that. But there was not very much specific kind of data there. But it occurred to me that really this needed to be studied, but it needed to be studied not sort of retrospectively in adults, but really prospectively in children to follow them forward. I was fortunate to meet a developmental psychologist, Penny Trickett. And Penny and I crafted this study we call the Female Growth and Development Study. And that name was chosen not to have sort of keep sexual abuse out of the study, just to make it kind of a study about child development and to protect the privacy also of our controls, because there would be comparison girls in there. We didn't want them falsely labeled as having been sexually abused, for example. And so we recruited a cohort of roughly about 90 sexually abused girls and 90 match control, actually what we call comparison girls. And they were controlled on age and race and socioeconomic status, and also whether they were in one or two family homes, parent family homes. And all the sexually abused girls, they were aged 6 to 15. So we were interested in spanning puberty, which is a period of time when there's a lot of mental health changes in young women. And so we then wanted to follow that cross section of 6 to 15 forward in time. And we have followed them for almost 40 years, really. I say 35 plus. They are now in their late 40s and early 50s. We've seen them 8 times. We looked very carefully at a whole series of biological systems, things like stress response systems, but also the gonadal systems or sort of sex systems like estrogen and testosterone and those sorts of things. Looked at their body maturation, looked at their development there. We looked at their cognition in terms of their IQ growth and verbal health. We looked at their immune systems. We looked at a whole variety of biological systems and cognitive systems, but also at their behavior. We looked at their behavior in terms of self-report. We had reports from teachers. We had reports from mostly foster parents or moms and that sort of thing. And we followed them. At time 6, we saw them 8 times. At time 6, we saw the children born to our original children. I saw 90% of the children born to our original children. And for the first 3 times until most of the girls turned 18, we saw their mothers or their caretakers, and got histories from them. So we got really 3 generations, and particularly looking at things like parenting across 3 generations and the sort of transmission or the risk for maltreatment as it crosses generations. And we found a large number of sort of biological dysfunctions or dysregulations in them. We can talk about some of them specifically if you want. We found that they came to puberty earlier, that their stress response systems were quite distorted or dysregulated, and that had repercussions downstream for things like body weight, and also later affected their DNA in terms of what we call epigenetic changes in their DNA. The sort of overall message was that these girls were aging faster than our comparison girls. And so what we were seeing was accelerated biological aging. And of course, aging is the biggest risk factor for all sorts of bad things happening to you, particularly leading causes of death and chronic illness, things like cancer and heart disease and dementia. That's really, in some ways, the bottom line of this long running study that had involved many people, probably 30, 40 collaborators over time.
When you say it changes DNA and accelerates aging, I guess my main question is just how? How does that trauma end up getting embedded in someone's systems and change them physically at that level?
Well, that's the critical question, isn't it? How does trauma work its way into the biological systems and then get expressed over time? And that appears to be changes in the DNA that we call epigenetic changes. And so the DNA has the sequence of bases that sort of code for your genes. But then there's another level, and that has to do with how those codes are expressed in time, and are those genes turned on or turned off? And we particularly looked at a process called methylation, which is the attachment of methyl groups to certain tags in on the DNA. And what that does is it prevents the DNA from replicating properly or as frequently. And so part of what they're doing is we're changing how the genes are being expressed and when they're being expressed. And that seems to be connected to this aging process. Now, different organs age actually at different rates. So your brain ages at a different rate than your heart, and that varies person by person. We don't all just age in some nice long linear way, but certain organs are aging faster than other organs. And some of that's a lifestyle issue, and some of that is a genetic issue, and some of that's a kind of environmental experience issue. If you're, starved, for example, it has profound effects on your body for the rest of your life. If you have a period of severe starvation, some of the studies after World War II, looking at populations, for example, that were starved after the war and what they call the hungry winter, had very profound effects on their bodies for the rest of their lives, even though they later could gain weight and everything. So trauma embeds itself, and it seems to embed itself by affecting certain biological systems, which in the long run seem to alter the DNA through this epigenetic process.
You followed these women from childhood through adulthood. And, you mentioned a few things so far, but I just thought maybe we should start off on the younger end. Like how did you see child abuse impact these girls in their early years?
Well, one of the things we witnessed was something that had been observed, but nobody kind of understood the mechanism, which is that they gain weight faster. And by age 18, the average girl who was sexually abused in our study was heavier than 75% of females her age. And so you saw this very rapid, and this seems to be an effect of the cortisol alterations in these children. They had higher levels of cortisol. And when we stress them with mild stressors, what we call social stressors, making them give a speech in front of people or something like that, they had much larger responses. But around age 16, 17, their cortisols became lower than our comparison girls. And this is what we call this attenuation curve. And the shape of that curve seemed to have real effects on a number of processes, but particularly on weight gain for them. Whereas all our comparison girls who were matched on socioeconomic status and race and they basically tracked the 50th percentile. I mean, they were just sort of right, truly average, but our maltreated girls really diverged quite rapidly. They were always heavier, but by that age, they were significantly heavier. They were heavier than 75% of girls. This was something that was actually observed by other people in clinics in which they looked at people who had morbid obesity, and over again, they found histories of sexual abuse in these individuals. And that now we had a mechanism that we could actually demonstrate in terms of sort of statistically, if you had this curve, this is what was going to happen to your weight. Now there are still more layers to unpack exactly how this happens, but yes, we're finding that these distortions or dysregulations of the biological system play out in changes in the body, which play out in health and mental health and medical health, and also just how well they do socially.
Yeah, and how did it impact them mentally and socially?
Well, certainly more depression, more anxiety, more dissociation. In particular, dissociation turns out to have been a very powerful factor in terms of predicting who would do well and who did not do well. And even dissociation measured very early, when the very first session that they came to see us was predictive of all sorts of behavioral problems down the line for them, and also more re-victimization. But things like self-mutilation, suicide attempts, being involved in domestic violence, those sorts of things also. So the girls who had this were particularly likely to be re-victimized, re-traumatized, and trauma's cumulative, basically. The more you're traumatized, sort of the worse the outcome is likely to be.
As we start to get into adulthood, I mean, how did you see this abuse impacting the women that they ultimately became?
Well, none of them ever got a four-year college degree. Most of them dropped out of high school, sort of mean age around 11th grade or so. Many of them were pregnant early. We had 2.5 times the rate of premature births in our abuse group than we had in our comparison group. They had more arrests and more kind of problems with domestic violence, for example.
At this point, as you said, a lot of these women were having children of their own. And so you've really got multiple generations in this study. What did you notice about how this impacted their relationships with their children in the future?
We had three generations to look at. We had the mothers of our original girls, we had our original girls, and then we had their offspring. And what we saw was that particularly those original girls who had high levels of dissociation were much more likely to be what we would engage in what we would call harsh parenting and to have more disrupted attachments with their children. And that sets those children up for worse outcomes. We know that attachment is measured even really at about 18 months of age. Now, we were measuring attachment at much older ages, but attachment is measured as early as 18 months of age is very predictive of who's going to do well and who isn't. And secure attachments are really very important. And most of these kids did not have secure attachments, but many of them had what we call type D, disorganized, disoriented attachments. And that's a particularly poor prognostic sign.
Did you see that same kind of dynamic and relationship with the original girl's parents, too?
Yes, we did. And we saw that same pattern of sort of harsh parenting. But we also saw what the mothers of our abused girls had high rates of sexual abuse in childhood themselves. They also had more histories of physical abuse and domestic violence and mental illness, that they were suffering the results themselves. And we asked them about their parents, which they sort of a hearsay about their parents. And it really went back even farther, though we couldn't really quantify that, but we were able to quantify this for three generations. And the children of our abused children had much more problems. They were more likely to become abused themselves. And they were also more likely to have all sorts of depression and school problems and behavior problems and that sort of thing. I mean, these mothers had PTSD, they had depression, they had anxiety, they were more likely to be involved with partners who were not healthy. And they were more likely to be victims of domestic violence. And so there was ongoing trauma in the lives of many of our abused girls and in their mothers. And so this goes on. It doesn't just sort of stop. The other point I would want to make is that we were looking at in-home family abuse. So this was not sex trafficking or something like this. This was done by a family member, what we would classically call incest. And we found that the relationship was very important in terms of worse outcomes. So the worst thing that could happen to you was to be sexually abused by your father, your biological father. Not as bad by your uncle, but the closer the biological relationship, often sort of the worse the outcome was. The other thing was that because this was happening in the home, the number of times they were molested was huge. It was staggering. Most people think of it as once or twice or something like this. This was in the hundreds of times. And then on top of that, there were all the like, when is the next episode going to happen? So there's this anxiety and this sense of always being at risk and always having to be vigilant, those sorts of things.
This is a hard question, but I hear a lot, or I feel like at least it's a message that gets tossed out there a lot, that survivors of sexual abuse can go on to similarly abuse others and sort of continue this cycle. Did you end up seeing anything like that in this study?
So that's a really important question. I'm glad you asked it because it's a lot of people are listening are probably asking themselves that question. And the answer is that, as best I can tell, I looked into this really hard a couple of years ago. I went through every literature, including foreign language studies, and looked at every study I could find to figure out what is that transmission rate. And the number I come up with based on sort of all of that is about 30%. So it means that 70% do not. I mean, I think that's the good news here, that 70% of victims do not go on to abuse their children. Okay, so you're more likely not to do this than to do this. But 30%, roughly 30%, go on to do that. Often in the case of women, it's not that they're the abuser, it's that they pair up with an abusive male. And it's a lack of vigilance on their part, uh, more than that they're actually the abuser themselves. But there's also in these families a lot of domestic violence, and these kids are also exposed to domestic violence, a certain amount of physical abuse, and then also there's just a lot of emotional abuse going on in these homes, unfortunately.
I mean, I have to imagine, did some of the girls you studied manage to break the cycle, even of just having a harsh relationship with their children, and find, I guess, what we might describe as some sort of healing?
Yes, and one of the things I would stress is there's a wide range of outcomes. It's not a doomsday thing. It's not inevitable, but it's more likely, kind of. It's a probability deal, but the probability is that if these things happen to you, you're likely to have lots of, things happen to your body and to your mental health, but doesn't necessarily mean you're going to fail at everything in life or be a terrible parent. The one thing that seems to be really important here is that the people who do well have talked to somebody about their abuse and have acknowledged it and been owned it in some way. It doesn't have to be a therapist. It can be your best friend. But it's that act of putting words on it and acknowledging it and saying that's not going to happen to my child. I'm not going to let that go on. That is really very important in breaking that cycle. And that's where we really have to focus, I think, in terms of prevention, is this focusing in on what I'd call this mother-child pair and working if there's abuse, we discover abuse in the home, we work with the child to help heal the child and help the mother and strengthen that attachment and bond in that relationship. I think this is the way we break the cycle of violence in terms of prevention programs.
We're speaking with Dr. Frank Putnam, co-founder of the Female Growth and Development Study, which has been studying the impacts of child sex abuse on girls for more than 35 years. Putnam's new book on the study is Old Before Their Time, a scientific life investigating how maltreatment harms children and the adults they become. You mentioned that some of the girls were able to get help through talking to other people, be it a therapist or a friend. I guess, are there different treatments available out there for survivors of child sex abuse? And if so, what are some of the better options?
So I'm not going to endorse any really specific treatment, but I'm going to talk about, in general, I think the group of treatments, what we call the cognitive behavioral therapies, are probably the most successful treatments. Sometimes medication is helpful to take the edge off of things like depression or anxiety. But what really seems to work is trauma-focused CBT type treatments, cognitive behavioral type treatments. And there are some good ones for adults, and there are a couple of good ones for children now. and that have been developed and have a lot of evidence behind them, much more than most people realize. I still hear people out there going, well, there's no way to treat this. That's not true. There are, in fact, effective treatments out there. They're just simply not as available as they should be.
Well, on that note, like at a government level, I guess, how are we currently addressing child sex abuse? And are there ways that you think we can improve that?
Well, a large part of the book is devoted to if I had my way, what would I be doing? What would I be recommending? And I would certainly be recommending a overhaul of the child protection system. I would also, I give a couple of examples of innovative programs that have really made the whole child protection process much easier for the families. It's this very stressful thing. One thing I did for a dozen years was actually run a forensic center that evaluated cases of child maltreatment. So I saw them as they came in the door, referred by however. We evaluated and made assertions about the medical issues, et cetera. Ultimately, it was the district attorney who decides whether there's a criminal charge or not. Most of the cases went through sort of more social changes through Child Protective Services. My concern about child protection is it's run at a county level. And so you have about 3,000 different child protection systems out there. And that we need more standardization. That what I saw was essentially the same cases being treated very differently across the board. There's a very good movement called Child Advocacy Centers, CACs they're known, and they're really set up as units dedicated to the evaluation of child maltreatment, and they have a mental health piece um, associated with them, and they're also often involved in protection programs. There are about 700 of these in the country, and this is probably the single best approach. And I describe that in the book, how they came to be through a congressman named Bud Kramer, and there's a group called the National Children's Alliance that basically represents all of these sort of child advocacy centers.
Okay, and at a societal level, I think survivors of all ages still face a lot of stigma when they speak up about what happened to them. How can we combat that?
Well, I think that's one of the important things is, in fact, for us, for as a society and as a group to talk about this more. Talking about it helps in a couple of different ways. And one, as we said, those people who can talk about it seem less likely to repeat it. And also talking about it doesn't give the perpetrators a place to hide. I mean, they depend on the secrecy. And once they're unmasked and then they're less likely to be able to do this or victimize others. And we see that it's very hard to unmask some of these people given the difficulty releasing certain files.
A quick question I had while I was reading the book, I guess is why focus on girls? I mean, boys obviously face child sex abuse as well. Are you interested in studying the impact on boys too?
So that was always an agenda for us, was to have a parallel sort of male growth and development study. And we submitted multiple grants on this, and we never could get it funded. And it's important because boys have a different experience. Most of the girls are abused in the context of the home, and many of the males are abused outside the home by coaches and teachers and scout leaders, and that's a very different experience. They're abused at different ages, generally fewer episodes. There may be more or less force or coercion involved in that. So we don't really know. We chose girls partly because we wanted to look at that biology, particularly the maturation, the puberty and those sorts of things. I think certain things are also going on like that with the males. We just don't have very much data about males. And it's important also because one of the things that seems to happen is the females often end up as being re-victimized multiple times. The males that we know about seem to have the propensity to become offenders. And so understanding what's going on with the males and can we break that offender connection is really an important thing also.
Well, Dr. Putnam, thanks so much for taking the time. Is there anything that we haven't touched on yet that you want survivors to know?
Well, I want to re-emphasize that this is not fate. that if you were the victim of the abuse, the chances are you're not going to be an abuser, but you need to be vigilant that you don't connect with people who are abusers. And you need to do something to take care of yourself, because taking care of yourself is also taking care of your children. It's not your fault, and as time goes on, you become a survivor of this, and it has profound effects. And many of the things you shouldn't blame yourself for, that they're a result of what happened to you. But you don't want to continue this or repeat it or deny it, and that treatment does really help.
Dr. Frank Putnam is a professor of clinical psychiatry at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine and co-founder of the Female Growth and Development Study, now at the University of Rochester. His new book compiling the findings of the decades-long study is called Old Before Their Time, a scientific life investigating how maltreatment harms children and the adults they become. It's out now through Routledge Publishing. You can find a full list of the study's articles on Dr. Putnam's website, frankputnam.com. Dr. Putnam, thanks again for taking the time.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this.
Again, if you or someone you love has been impacted by child sex abuse, help is available. Child Help has counselors available 24/7 at its hotline, 1-800-422-4453. You can text or call that number. Child Help also has a list of state-by-state contacts where you can report child abuse at its website, childhelphotline.org. Thanks for listening to this week's 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Madeline Reynolds, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can stay in the loop on all of WAMC's shows by signing up for our weekly newsletter, Airwaves, at WAMC.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King, 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. The nightmare down the hall